In the age of AI, everyone wants to tighten the feedback loop. Being able to adapt, be flexible, and be willing to change my opinion. Instead of waiting weeks to get user feedback, we can just ship it and see what happens. The price you pay for not experimenting is like you don't actually know what's possible.
You're listening to We Built What? The podcast for engineering leaders building in the agentic era. I'm Emma Webb from Augment, and I'm so pleased to be here today with Wei-Wei Wu, CEO of Momentic. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So Wei-Wei, you just recently closed your Series A. Congratulations. Can you tell me a little bit about the thesis behind Momentic? What are you building?
Yeah. Momentic is the AI verification layer for software. We are the guardrails to make sure your software actually works the way you intend it to, for your end users. So, powering some of our customers like Notion, like Built, Quora, Webflow, Xero, and more.
So this is such an important problem right now, and I'm really curious, why do we need a standalone company to do it?
Yeah, I think one of the things that's really interesting is as we see teams adopt more and more AI tools, is they're shifting towards plain English specs for how they talk to their AI coding agent for coding. We want to make that spec also the way you would verify, along with all the success criteria, all the edge cases, just the way you would describe how you would build it. That's exactly how you would verify the AI agent's work as well.
So the spec is in the verification step as well. It's not just the design stage.
Exactly. So like the spec is kind of how we think of it as the source of truth for how your product or feature is supposed to behave.
So if I'm thinking about kind of how we build software in the agentic era, one of the things I think about or that people talk about is you really don't want the same agent that wrote the code to also be verifying it. Is that part of why Momentic as well?
Yeah. I think I am tasking all of my little, AI robots to write code for me. We have them all hooked up in Slack, for example, internally at Momentic. But at the same time, I also want proof that it did its work correctly. And, this goes beyond just, static code review, linters, unit tests and things like that. I actually want to see it work from our users' perspective. And I think it's important that it's a separate tool that's actually verifying the work, but it also works well with the AI that's building the feature in the first place. I think it's a ecosystem that kind of grows together.
Yeah, it's so interesting. I think there's this really big conversation right now about what it means to be AI native. What does that look like for you at Momentic? How is your team building? Can you tell me a little bit about how do we build now?
Yeah, that's a good question. When I first started coding in high school, we were using Notepad++, or like I think in college I was using like Sublime Text. That was like before Cursor or any other AI coding tool existed. I would not consider myself AI native. AI native is like someone who grew up with AI. I think the way we approach using and adopting AI is also quite different as well. But I think for me, like I would consider myself very flexible. It's like, especially as the founder of an AI native company, being able to adapt, be flexible, and kind of be willing to change my opinion about like what's possible.
It's really interesting to me because basically the way you describe it is there's kind of a before and after. And in my mind, if we're thinking AI native is someone who's always built that way, gosh, what a small cohort of people that is, right?
I agree. I think having experience in a non-AI native is important for context setting. Instead of me prompting in my editor, I used to have to type things out by hand. That's insane. It was just actual code autocomplete, not just tab completes and things like that.
Mm-hmm. In my day, I'm like picturing you around the fire in the future, telling your grandkids, in my day, we coded by hand.
Like in the future, I imagine, I have an electrode attached to my temple. I'm just thinking, software into existence.
Yeah, it's become a bit of a problem because I build so many apps now that nobody wants them. You know what I mean? And I'm like, look at this cool thing I built. And they're like, you can send me one per week. Like that's your maximum app distribution. So I think about that too. Like, what is our appetite for this, for kind of this creation. Where is the limit of that? I don't know.
We should be testing the latest and greatest and see what are the things that are actually bringing us, 10x, 100x productivity gains. And I think part of that means that we have to experiment a lot, maybe build a lot of different apps, build a lot of different integrations and see what works, because the price you pay for not experimenting is like you don't actually know what's possible. And I think it's important to build things, test things out, even say, if 99% of them fail, like 1% is going to be, a huge lever for your team.
Yeah, and I think part of that discipline then becomes too, like, how do we find so much more comfort than we're used to in killing those apps or killing that code, or saying, we tried this thing, it's kind of dumb, it didn't work out, or good idea, let's remix it and put it over here. And I think about even that cleanup stage, I think that's something that we haven't fully figured out yet, because we've never had this proliferation of application or proliferation of code that is so disposable.
Instead of saying, like, say, waiting weeks to get user feedback, we publish Momentic multiple times a day. We can just ship it and see what happens. There's a lot of value in just getting it out there, experimenting, and see what works or not, because it's very easy to fix or update.
Yeah, it totally makes sense. At Momentic, I know you're thinking a lot about this validation step, and you're a team that's really kind of at the forefront of thinking about that idea. Your customers have run 2 billion test steps. Is there anything interesting that's happened in this data that you're seeing in their behavior? Obviously, they're coming to you because they're in this AI moment, looking for an AI solution. What are you observing from what you're seeing customers do?
Yeah, I think what we're seeing is that the rate of change, the rate of code output obviously has increased a lot, but I think depending on how teams adopt certain tools, like more output is not necessarily better, because I think it's important that more output, say like more code output, directly translates to, say, like, new features, better user experience. Everyone wants to tighten the feedback loop. How can you make it faster? And I think the form of that is through tests, say like a critical flow, like authentication or billing or anything like that. And I think the people who are shipping the most value are the ones who are optimizing for that feedback loop.
How do you think about the quality of the signal? Just in terms of, if I think about kind of in a pre-AI world, if I think about A/B testing, for example, part of the discipline of an A/B test is, okay, well, how long do I have to run it to get to any kind of significant signal? How do you think about that challenge now? Are people thinking about kind of like the volume of data that you need to get to significance? How do we decide?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think, I'm just thinking back when we first started, when Jeff and I first started Momentic, we were in YC, we had maybe like 2 paying customers, like what does statistically significant mean? We're gonna survey all of them, like two
2 out of 2.
2 out of 2 is not a lot of high signal data. So I think how we approach it today is, like, for example, in Slack, most of our customers have shared Slack channels with us. We collaborate with them, we meet very often with them, to get feedback, show them the latest and greatest. And I think the feedback that we collect is both like quantitative and qualitative. And like, for example, like we have session recordings, we can see how they're actually interacting with certain things. Like that doesn't necessarily require us to, have a survey or like, hey, what are the frictions of using Momentic today? How we shape product at Momentic, it's vibe-based, right? It's based off conversations we have with prospects, with customers. They're giving us feedback. We're seeing how they use Momentic in the wild. Do we have to survey, 300 users to get 95% with plus or minus 5% error bar? Like, probably not. But I think, based on all these conversations we've had with our customers, I'm pretty confident that this change will make their life better.
So interesting too, because we talk so much about the attributes of taste, of judgment, of kind of having conviction of what you're building, of intent. And so I think in many ways, the ability to decide based on vibes, based on taste, becomes even more important. Because if we're experimenting at this rate, if we're shipping at this rate, the data in many cases will never catch up to tell us, or it'll be too noisy.
Right.
It'll be very hard to distinguish signals. So yeah, I don't know. I think about just that taste quality. And the other thing I think about is, how do you teach taste and how do you develop that. But part of it is just shipping all the time, I think, and
Yeah.
getting a feel for, is this good or not?
We're essentially building the tools that we wish we had when we were engineers. Well, some of them are still engineers. And I think there's like incredible value in that, because, you may not necessarily be able to quantify it, but you kind of have an intuition for, oh, what is the workflow I would expect as an engineer for this specific developer tool.
At Momentic, you spend a lot of time, thinking about this validation step, thinking about this testing step. How is the role of that QA engineer changing? What are they doing now? How does their day-to-day shifting?
Yeah.
Tell me more about that.
I think the lines between roles are blurring more and more. And I think the barrier for entry into what we used to consider software is also blurring as well. So I think the titles, I think, will need to change in the very near future, because, what is an engineer? I think technically anyone could be an engineer today, if the bar is only getting higher and higher.
But in a sense, I imagine those folks sitting, as a QA engineer, evaluating, judging output as kind of your professional career, may be very well placed. Like may have this very well honed sense of judgment and taste because of that role of, my role has been historically to look for bugs, to look for issues, to find problems. That feels like a kind of a useful skill set at this moment.
Definitely. And I think that it's even more powerful when, now you're like, say I used to be a Q&A engineer. Now I'm actually building full-fledged features. Like, I have a much higher bar than, say, someone who has no experience, testing or verifying product. And I think that skill set is incredibly valuable. It's like, it's almost like kind of like thinking from first principles. Like, it's cool, we built this really cool software, but, how are all the people going to misuse it now? It's a text box. What are people going to type into it?
Oh, God.
And I think that type of thinking, I think, is incredibly valuable.
It's so interesting, too, because I think in some, especially bigger organizations, maybe that person really wanted to go. They're like, I see it, I can fix it, I have the skills to fix it, but for whatever reason, not allowed to.
I think we want to make that loop as tight as possible with as little middlemen as possible. And, I think that's how we can iterate really quickly and just move really fast.
So I'm curious, can you tell me more about how your engineering team is structured? I think this is, it sounds like such a kind of basic tactical question, but people are very interested in it at this moment because, if I can output at such a higher rate, if I have this feedback loop that's so much tighter, if I can be so much closer to both the customers and the code, okay, well, what does my team need to look like? How have you thought about that? How are y'all structured?
Yeah. That's a good question. And I think, today we're, Momentic is still pretty small. We're, 13 people, about to be 14. We have 7 engineers. The amount of parallelization we can unlock with AI is massive. So like now, instead of executing on 1 or 2, we can execute, like 4 or 5x more actual projects that are massive. So like, for example, we just launched Android support back in October. Like, iOS is coming in like a week. If you asked me, like, 2-3 years ago, like, how, if we wanted to do this, it was like, it's gonna take like 6 months to a year. Now it took like, a few weeks, maybe a month and a half. It's like, it's incredible.
What is the most overhyped thing in AI testing right now?
I think one of the most overhyped AI testing is really focusing on, like, well, I'm going to crawl your whole app. We're going to figure out every single thing your users are doing on your app, and we're going to generate tests for you. And I think that approach is, it sounds great on marketing. It's like, oh, I don't have to do anything. The AI is going to just figure out everything my users is doing, what's broken. But I think the problem is, I think there is like kind of like a chicken and egg thing. Like, what you have live in production is, a function of like what code you have deployed. And, just the nature of software, there's going to be bugs, and I anticipate there are going to be bugs for, quite a bit, even as, AI continues to improve. That's why we have all these, code review bots, just like 20 of them,
We have one. Yeah.
And for sure. So like, using production as your source of truth is just fundamentally flawed, because production will have bugs. Saying that we're just going to use AI to crawl your app and figure out what's wrong is just like, well, how do you actually know what's wrong? Because, what's actually live in production might not actually be what you want.
This is so interesting. I've been thinking about this too, just in terms of your kind of what exists may not be your ideal. And so kind of your opportunity space is the delta between your ideal and what's out there today. But I guess this is why you guys go back to the spec. You're like, the spec is what we're trying to get to. Just because the code is this, that doesn't mean, that's what you were trying to achieve.
Yeah. I think if anything, being specific in what you want and what you don't want, that's incredibly important, because whatever you tell AI, anything that's ambiguous, it's definitely going to go there. So I think, in that sense, like, we're thinking about like specs as the source of truth. Like, these specs are kind of your North Star, what you want your software to look like, how you want your product to behave. I think it's important to make that distinction.
I think we're so used to just imagining that the thing that has been built is the thing that we meant to be building the whole time. And in fact, like, we may not know if we're trying to go.
I was like, when a test fails, how do you know that it's the test's fault, or maybe the feature change was intentional, or maybe it was a breakage? And they're like, we don't know. Support docs are out of date. PRDs got out of date. The Jira ticket got implemented, 2 months ago. There's been like a few thousand commits since then. Figuring out what it's actually supposed to do, how it's supposed to work, I think is going to become more and more important, especially as we delegate more stuff to AI.
It sounds really basic, but it's not.
Yeah.
Yeah. There's so much that's really interesting in that idea. You founded a company about quality, and there's this whole conversation right now about the tension between slop and the tension between quality. Like, we have so much more throughput, we can ship so much faster, we can do so much more. How should engineering leaders think about where the quality bar is?
Yeah, I don't want to dictate where the bar should be set, but I think the bar is higher than before. I think just because you can ship a lot more code, it doesn't necessarily mean you're shipping higher quality code. I think there's incredible value in kind of stepping back to think, like, from first principles, like, what are the problems we're actually trying to solve for our customers? How do we want to solve it? And like, how we actually present it to your end user. I think one of the things that we're very excited about is that, the ground is shifting beneath our feet, and quality is more important than we think. And, I think, and to have high quality, you need to be specific. I find myself, when I'm creating linear tickets, I just put in the title, and then I'm just thinking about, okay, if I gave this to, say, some AI agent to build it, will it actually know what I want it to build? I have this random idea in my head, but it's not like, my engineers or AI can read my mind. I need to be specific about what I want and what it needs to look like.
What do I really mean?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
You have to be clear and exact to the AI.
To your point, ambiguity is not a good thing for your agents.
Yeah, it can spend money now. It can send emails. I'm like, I don't know if I wanted to do that.
You're like, how well did you prompt it? What are the guardrails?
Yeah, there's all this hype about, AI agents are going to be able to do everything for us. And there's not as much thought on like, well, do you actually want it to do that for you? It's like, I don't really want it to, pay my rent for me, or sign a lease for me.
Right.
I want to tour the apartment kind of thing, right? It's like, I don't really want to be in like the Wall-E movie, sitting there on the chair and be like.
I think about that movie so much these days. Like, it's a lot. It's in my head all the time. Wei-Wei, it's been really fun chatting with you.
Thank you.
You've been listening to We Built What? If you like what you heard, please like, subscribe, share with your friends, humans or agent. And if there's someone you think we should interview, let us know. Thanks so much.